Well, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I think we have nearly as many here by Zoom as we do live. I mean, I think we have about half and half, which is good. That'll work. Renee, we were talking earlier. Is Canadian still playing football?
No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's good. We're glad of that. We're proud of Sis for doing so well at the national finals in the rodeo. That was good. We know we got a lot of people who are ill. We've got a lot of people who have passed. That Kay's niece, 48-year-old, passed away unexpectedly, heart attack. Lawyer in Dallas with 2 kids, husband. Not a good deal. But we appreciate prayers on behalf of that family, because that was a shock. Betty Jo's granddaughter. Neil White over in Wellington passed away. Has been here many times when we've had our area-wide singing. We miss him. Dan Hawthorne is home. Lacey Montgomery is at home, but has to go back for a valve replacement on his heart. So we want to keep Lacey in mind. And I know there's lots of others that we need to keep in mind. Can't remember everybody. There's a lot of people with COVID. Peter has COVID, but is doing very well. Doing very well. The only symptom he has is no smell. Other than that, he's fine. His family is doing well, which we're very grateful for. I know I have mentioned that we had some good news on Kim's health. We had a diagnosis of cancer, and that was a misdiagnosis. And that's a good news. That's very good news. She's still got to go to the doctor, but that's doing well. And the other thing is I'm glad to see everybody. I'm glad to see him, be able to talk to them on the internet, on the picture, or see you here personally. It's good to see people. We are so isolated these days that when we can get together, it's good, however that may be, whether that is live or virtually. I'm very pleased of that. I got to tell you, many times when we have a trial or maybe a hearing, a lawyer will come up to me and they'll say, "Judge, what could I have done better? Or what did I do wrong? What did I do right?" They just want to know what they could do better. And a lot of times I'll tell them the best thing you could do better would be to have better facts on your side, or maybe a better client. When you have a situation where you have 3 credible eyewitnesses that are sitting there saying your man did it, your great, brilliant argument really doesn't matter too much. Several years ago, back when we were in partnership together, Kay did a lot of appeals. She's actually a very good appellate attorney. She is. And she did some criminal appeals. And we had this one case one time where the guy was over, and the allegation against him, he'd been convicted at the trial court, then went up on appeal, that he had been in jail over in Collinsworth, then he had escaped from jail, and on his way out of town, he had robbed the Alsops after his escape. Now, he got rearrested, and he got tried. And at trial, he doesn't argue the escape too much. That's pretty easy to prove. You got the document saying he was ordered into jail, then you have the jailer to say he wasn't there. That's all there is to it. And he didn't argue that. He knew he'd escaped. But he argued hard that he had not robbed the Alsops on his way out of town. He says they must have the wrong guy. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. And at trial, his attorney does a really good job. He gets in there and he gets the Alsops cashier up there and he says, "Well, how long did this take?" And the guy says, "Well, it's just about a minute." The guy walks in, puts a gun in my face, demands the money, I give it to him, and he leaves. Didn't take long at all. "So you didn't get to look at my client for very long?" I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Well, did you know him beforehand?" He says, "No, that's the first time I've ever seen him, was that night." He says, "Well, did he have a gun?" He says, "Yes, he did. It's the biggest gun I've ever seen. He stuck it right in my face. That barrel had to be that big. I was staring at it." And the lawyer says to him, he says, "You didn't know him before. You'd only saw him for a very short amount of time. And all that time you had a gun that you were looking at. How can you be so sure that it was my client?" He says, "Well, I'm sure it was. You see, when he came in, he wasn't wearing a shirt. And across his back, when he left, he had his name tattooed across his shoulders, Salinas. And if you'll have him take his shirt off, you'll see it. And of course, when the prosecutor gets back up, he says, Judge, I want him to take his shirt off. And he takes his shirt off, and there across his back says Salinas. So when you have facts like that, it doesn't matter how brilliant you may be, your arguments are not going to work. You need better facts than that. Now, I do take it seriously when they ask that. And usually what I tell them is it's not nearly as important what you say as it is what the jury actually hears. That you can have the most brilliant argument ever. And if you don't communicate that to the jury, it doesn't matter. It's more important what they hear. Kay used to tell me when I was making jury arguments, and one of my weaknesses is I spent so much time with the case, and I was so familiar with the facts of it, that I didn't always do a good job of explaining all the underlying facts to the jury. I assumed that because I knew them, they knew them too. And that was a weakness, that I didn't do that very well. And sometimes I would have a failure to communicate very well. Y'all remember that old Paul Newman movie back in the 60s? Cool Hand Luke? I like that movie. It's one of my favorites. It's got lots of good lines, got lots of good scenes. It's got some funny lines. It's got some very dramatic lines, some suspense. Got just a little bit of romance. Not much, but just a little bit. But there's lots of good lines in there. Paul Newman is a convict back in the South. And he's part of a work gang. And the warden is played by an actor named Strother Martin. And there's one scene where Paul Newman has escaped. And then they've recaptured him. They've brought him back to prison. And the warden is addressing all the prisoners. And the warden says to him, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And that line comes up several times. Failure to communicate. And sometimes that is a problem for lawyers. It may be a problem just in regular communication. Or judges. And sometimes it may be a problem for preachers. There's a failure to communicate. And sometimes that is the speaker's problem. That we don't do a good enough job of saying what we mean. But sometimes it's the listener's problem. That they don't do a good enough job of listening. And today we're going to look at a passage in the Bible where we have a failure to communicate. And we're going to look at Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And he said to them, What do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory. Jesus said to them, You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink? Are we baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And they said to him, We are able. And Jesus said to them, The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You know, when we read this passage, I think it's very typical that we look at it and we say, those stupid apostles, how could they be so stupid? They have walked with Jesus. They have spent 3 years at least with Jesus. They've listened to him. They've seen the way he treats people. And they still don't understand. How could they be so stupid? And I think maybe there's a little worthwhile to that. But in reality, I think that we need to look a little deeper. I think just to look at it that way would be a little shallow. And maybe if we look at it together, maybe we can come up with something that we can learn from for us all. And that's one of the verses, 10:41. When I read this passage, sometimes I almost overlook this. And when the 10 heard it, that obviously on one side we have Jesus and James and John. They're over here, they're having a conversation. And the other apostles are over here, and they're overhearing that conversation between Jesus and James and John. And I think that sometimes that's a good way for us to look at the Bible. As if we are there, listening to Jesus. And we hear what Jesus says. We overhear what he's saying. And if we look at it that way, if we can imagine ourselves at the scene and overhearing it, I think that's a good way to look at the Bible and to look at it with an open mind that we may learn. But if we are going to be looking at this as if we are overhearing Jesus and James and John, we've got to also put a little context in this to help us try to understand, because they had context when they overheard it. And one thing we need to see is what went right before this, is that Jesus predicts his death. He tells them that when I go up to Jerusalem, the people are going to capture me, the authorities are going to take me, they're going to mock me, they're going to spit on me, and they're going to beat me, and they're going to kill me. And then on the third day, I'm going to arise again. And so they've seen this. But they don't always understand it. And we need to realize that when we see that they don't understand this passion prediction, his death, is this is not the first time that Jesus has told them about his death. In chapter 8 in the book of Mark, in 8:31, Jesus predicts his death. In chapter 9, verse 31, he again predicts his death. And then here in chapter 10, he's told them for the third time that when he goes up to Jerusalem, he's going to be captured, he's going to be killed, and he will arise on the third day. Now we see here in chapter 10 that the disciples don't understand by the way they respond. Now Jesus is telling them, we're going to go up, and I'm going to be captured and killed. And the disciples say, we want to sit at your right hand. They're concerned with who's going to be in authority, who's going to sit on your right hand, who's going to sit on your left hand in your kingdom, rather than seeing the importance of what he's saying. They keep looking at this. They see the kingdom of heaven as one that is based upon power and violence that by achieving your glory. Not as Jesus looks at it, as it's a kingdom based upon Jesus himself and on what he does and what he teaches. The disciples keep looking at this as a kingdom based upon the politics of power, instead of looking at it as the politics of Jesus. In chapter 9, when we look at chapter 9, and he makes his passion prediction, immediately after that, there's a passage showing they don't understand. It says that immediately after Jesus talking to them about his death, that the disciples are discussing amongst themselves who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus again tells them that greatness in the kingdom of heaven is based on service. That you have to be the least of all to be great in the kingdom of heaven. That you must be willing to take up your cross and follow me. And we keep looking at these guys and we keep asking ourselves, how could they not understand what Jesus is teaching? Jesus has told them over and over, if you want to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you must be a servant. He not only teaches this, but he exhibits it. He teaches it with words and with his actions. Jesus is not someone who just talks the talk. He's not a do as I say, not as I do. He walks the walk. And they don't understand. But when we look at this, Jesus' prediction of his death is not just recorded in the book of Mark, it's also in the book of Luke. And it tells us right after that the apostles, but they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. Now, I don't know exactly what it means when the Bible tells us that the meaning was hidden from them. Whether that meant that somehow supernaturally they were prevented from understanding, or just that they didn't understand because that's where they were. They just didn't understand. But it tells us completely and clearly that they did not understand. And then they exhibit that by what they do. But when we look at chapter 8, and we look at that foretelling there, we see that it tells us, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders, and the chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days arise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside, and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men. You know, when we look at that, what always sticks out in our minds, and sticks out in my mind, is that get behind me, Satan. That's a very dramatic statement that he tells Peter. And we see that. It's almost scary. And I recognize that we should look at that. But sometimes by looking at that, we don't look at the rest of that verse, where it tells us, For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And I think that's one of the problems the disciples had. That's one of the problems Peter had. And I think that's a problem we can have today. Because the society and the culture that Peter was living in, and the disciples were living in, there was no concept of a Messiah, a king, that would end up on a cross. The idea of the king would be that he would lead an army into the city conquering. And he would be the one in power and conquering. He would not be the one on the cross. He would be one sending people to the cross. And they couldn't see that. They couldn't get past their own culture. And I think when we look at ourselves, we're not that much different. Our culture impacts us every day. And how we look at the kingdom of heaven and how we look at our lives. Our culture tells us that we need to be wealthy and popular. And we need to have the biggest houses. And that's not the way the kingdom of heaven is looked at, is it? That's a difference. You know, Martin Luther King, in one of his last sermons, he based a sermon on this passage that we're looking at today. He entitled it, The Drum Major Effect. And what his point was, is that in today's society, we want to be the drum major out in front of the band, leading the parade. We want everyone to see us, and we want to be somebody. And we want people to see that we're somebody. And he tried to contrast that with what God wants. That our society and our advertising every day tells us we want the biggest house, the nicest car, the most money, the most popular. That's what we want. And that's not what Jesus teaches at all. Jesus teaches us that we need to be part of the kingdom of heaven. We need to be able to imagine ourselves as a servant of all. When we look at chapter 10, and we see the James and John making that request, we see the other disciples listening in, I don't think they understood what Jesus was talking about. And I think that we look at this passage, and like I said, sometimes we say stupid apostles. But I think our problem is that we don't understand it either. We have to look a little deeper to see an understanding here. And when we look at this passage and we think, those stupid apostles, it's interesting to see how Jesus looks at them and how he responds to them. You know, I've said, let's imagine that we're overhearing this conversation between Jesus and James and John as the apostles did. And I do think that's a good way to look at it. But we don't actually get to overhear, do we? Because we don't hear Jesus' tone. We don't hear his inflection. In the written word, you don't get the tone or the inflection. And that's sometimes very important to understand. It's how did they say it? Not just what did they say, but how did they say it? And I think when we look at how I would respond to the apostles' request, I think I know how I'd respond. I think it would be, I have told you, and I have told you, and I have told you, and I have shown you what to do, and you still aren't doing it. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of what you're doing. And I think that I can hear myself saying that because I've said it. I have looked at people and said, I have told you what you need to do. I have told you what's going to happen if you do not comply with my orders. And I am tired of you. And I am mad at you almost. And that is not the tone that Jesus took at all. And I think that he has a lot more patience with the disciples. And I think I can learn from that. That I need to be more patient at times. I know I do. But when he talks to them It's not a diatribe of chastisement. It's not. It's much more of a correction. He wants to teach them. He does correct them. And he says that's not what you want. But he doesn't get mad at them. He doesn't treat them like sometimes he would treat the scribes and the Pharisees with that tone of voice. Jesus has told them that in the kingdom of heaven, you must be willing to serve. You must be willing to give your life on the cross if necessary. They don't understand that. But I don't think that has changed that much in the last 2,000 years, has it? It's still the same teaching today as it was when Martin Luther King preached that sermon in 1968. Same as it was 2,000 years ago. And as we look at it, again, aren't we glad that Jesus had patience with the apostles and with us? Because we're very grateful for that. When we look at Jesus' tone of voice, he also uses a lot of irony. When they're talking about, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I'll be baptized with? We all know that he's talking about his crucifixion. We have the advantage of looking at this from knowing the rest of the story. The apostles, we just say they should have known. But I think they know some of it. And when he says to them, can you be baptized with the baptism that I'm going to be baptized with? Can you drink the cup that I drink? They answer, yes, we can. But then Jesus says to them, yes, you will. I think when we look at that statement, if this was a movie, the sound would go down, the tension would come up, and it would be a very dramatic statement, because it is, because it points out to them that they are going to do that. It's not just what they think they will do or what they're willing to do, but they will. Sometimes I think that we don't give the apostles enough credit here. Did they understand everything? No, they didn't. But did they have some idea that it was risky to follow Jesus? And I think they did. Now, when he's told them in the past that you must be willing to take up your cross and follow me, that's a signifying that you need to be willing to die. Now, today, I think we look at that as the cross as something less than death. But in the Roman world, it was not. If you talked about going to the cross, you were talking about an ugly, painful, humiliating death. That's what it meant to the people at that time. It was not a piece of jewelry. It was not a symbol of hope or anything like that. It was a symbol of death. And I think they would have known that. Another example is, in the book of Luke, there's a time where Jesus is telling them, I need to go up to Jerusalem. And the disciples, they try to talk him out of it. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? The rabbis are seeking to capture Jesus and stone him and kill him. And they know that. And they say, don't go. Don't go up there. And Jesus says, no, I'm going to go anyway. And then when he does, so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go that we may die with him. That's one of those verses that should bring chills down our spine. As they wanted to go with Jesus, even though they understood that to go with him there was a risk that they could die. And they were going to go anyway. So sometimes I think we need to give them a little more credit than we typically do. They understood that there was a risk. And they understood that there could be death. Following Jesus was dangerous then, and it can be dangerous today if we truly serve Jesus. There is a risk. Now, we have seen him using irony in correcting the brothers. But when he continues to teach them, he also uses irony. He tells them in verses 42 and 43 that the world looks at leadership one way, and Jesus looks at it another, and they're not there yet. But he tells them that you will understand that there will, to be great in the kingdom of heaven, you must be the servant of all. And he also tells them that they will have it. That he has faith in them, even though he's told them, Even though He's shown them and they don't understand, He continues to have faith in them. And I think that's one of the points of this sermon and this passage that we miss sometimes, is Jesus' faith in the apostles. Because He tells them, but it shall not be so among you. He doesn't say, it shouldn't be so among you. This is not the way it should be. He has faith enough to say to them, it shall not be so. And I think when we look at the faith that Jesus had in the disciples, that He may have that kind of faith in us. And I think that is an encouragement to us. When we look at the apostles, and there was a failure to communicate, just like there was with Paul Newman back in Cool Hand Luke. There was failure to communicate. They didn't understand. But I think sometimes it's not so much a failure to communicate as it is a failure of imagination. As they were unable to imagine what Jesus was saying. They couldn't imagine it. They could not imagine the world the way that the Lord wanted it to be. They could not imagine the world the way Jesus was telling them. And I think we have that problem too today. That we have a lack of imagination to see the world the way Jesus wants us to. He wants us to see it a time of a kingdom of heaven, again, that is based not on the kingdom and politics of power, but on the politics of Jesus. A kingdom based upon the politics of love and service to one another, as opposed to a politics of domination. And our culture tells us that every day. We see that on the TV. We see it as we go down the street. And I think we need to have that better imagination in order that we can have better communication. Because, you know, when we were baptized and we take a communion, we share in communion, we're not just engaged in some ritualistic habit, a ritualistic practice. We, by taking communion and being baptized, we are being baptized into Jesus' life. And we are committing to live a life as Jesus lived it, to follow Him as the way He wants us to. And I think sometimes we have to have that vision and that imagination, and then the courage to go forward and do it. That we don't want to be like the disciples who don't have it, who are failing in that imagination and that communication. Because we know that we must be willing to serve each other, to serve Jesus, number one, and to serve our communities and our world. It's not based upon what the world says is right, but what Jesus does and what He showed us. And as I said, as we get ready to partake of communion, we're not just doing this as a habit. We're not just doing this as a ritual. We're doing it to show our commitment to Jesus. And as we finish up, if anyone has a need, and I know we have many needs, or if anyone has something they want to address us with, we would ask that you come while we stand and as we sing.